Recent DNA studies have confirmed what historians and scientists have long suspected, that Native Americans are, without exception, descended from peoples who migrated across the Bering Strait from Asia some 13,000 to 20,000 years ago. Today, the early Mormon claim that Native Americans descended from a small colony from Jerusalem about 600 BCE seems incredibly absurd. But when the Book of Mormon appeared in 1830, such a claim was extremely plausible, especially to the theologically minded. In Joseph Smith's day, the question of Indian origins was not only an antiquarian pastime, but it was a puzzle with serious theological implications. And it was with some degree of satisfaction that first-generation Mormons declared to the world that 3 centuries of speculation and debate about Indian origins in America had finally been settled with the Book of Mormon. Hi, I'm Dan Vogel. The purpose of this video is to explore the intellectual and theological discourse about Indian origins in the New World that preceded Joseph Smith's dictation of the Book of Mormon in 1829, and how the Book of Mormon might have participated in that discourse. In Joseph Smith's day, the Book of Mormon had a degree of plausibility and seemed to be a variation of the popular Lost 10 Tribe theory. But the more that was learned about Native Americans and America's ancient history, the less plausible the Book of Mormon became. This situation forced apologists to abandon first-generation assumptions and to invent a whole new way of reading the Book of Mormon. Instead of the Book of Mormon being the history of the peopling of ancient America and the source from whence Native Americans sprang, most apologists now argue that the Book of Mormon is the history of only a small group of people that lived concurrently with the Mayans in the limited region of Central America, and that Lehi's Israelite DNA got lost or diluted in the sea of Asiatic DNA. This video is less concerned with the apologists' attempt to downsize the Book of Mormon and make it more palatable to the modern reader than it is with placing the Book of Mormon in the only historical setting we can be sure of, 1829 upstate New York, or in other words, Joseph Smith's cultural, intellectual, and theological world, which we can only access indirectly through the printed text. William W. Phelps aptly captured the enthusiasm of early Mormon converts when he declared in 1833 that wonderful conjecture which left blank as to the origin of the American Indians was done away by the Book of Mormon. 4 years later, Parley P. Pratt said the Book of Mormon reveals the origin of the American Indians, which was before a mystery. By Joseph Smith's time, Indian origins in the New World had generated considerable speculation and debate. Discovery of the American Indian had created a theological puzzle for biblical literalists who wondered how the Americas had been populated after the flood by people who were apparently distinct from any counterpart in the Old World. Skeptics and deists, hoping to cast doubt on the Bible's authority, exploited the situation by suggesting the American Aborigines were pre-Adamites, who represented a completely different creation from Adam. If Native Americans were unrelated to Adam, they reasoned, were they not also free from the effects of the fall, and, hence, had no need for Jesus' atonement? Prior to the discovery of America, the pre-Adamite controversy had raged in Europe over African and Asian populations. Discovery of ancient civilizations in America provided philosophers with what they perceived as conclusive proof for their pre-Adamite theory. Jedediah Morse, a congregational pastor in Charlestown, Massachusetts, summed up the controversy in 1793. Those who call in question the authority of the sacred writings say the Americans are not descendants from Adam, But this is one among many weak hypotheses of unbelievers, and is wholly unsupported by history. Public debate over the consequences of such a belief dates to at least the final decade of the 16th century, when Englishman Thomas Nash wrote in 1593, "Impudently, unbelievers persist in it, that the late discovered Indians are able to show antiquities thousands of years before Adam." In the mid-17th century, Isaac de la Pereire, a Calvinist of Bordeaux, France, wrote the first book-length exploration of the pre-Adamite theory, titled A Theological System upon the Presupposition that Men Were Before Adam. In the preface, La Pereire described the world newly discovered and declared the men of which, it is probable, did not descend from Adam. La Pereire's arguments gave Christian Europe a tremendous theological jolt. Many books and pamphlets rebutting La Pereire's postulates immediately appeared. In America, Bernard Romans, civil engineer, naturalist, and cartographer, published in 1775 a natural history of Florida, in which he argued for a separate creation for Native Americans. Based on his own observations, he believed the Aborigines of America draw their origin from a different source than either Europeans, Chinese, Negroes, Moors, Indians of India, or any other species of the human genus, of which I think there are many species, as well as among most other animals, and that they are not a variety occasioned by a commixture of any of the above species. The above account will perhaps raise a conjecture that I believe the red men are not come from the westward out of the east of Asia. I do not believe it. I am firmly of opinion that God created an original man and woman in this part of the globe, of different species from any in the other parts. Henry Home, a Scottish judge of some wealth, better known as Lord Kames, shared Roman's opinion. In his Sketches on the History of Man, reprinted in Philadelphia in 1776, Home wrote, "I venture still further, which is to conjecture, that America has not been peopled from any part of the Old World." A blistering response from Samuel Stanhope Smith, a Presbyterian minister and member of the American Philosophical Society of Philadelphia, represented the sentiments of many who were concerned about such arguments. When ignorance pretends to sneer at revelation and at opinions held sacred by mankind, it is too contemptible to provoke resentment or to merit retaliation in kind. But of course, such opinions did provoke retaliation. Those who wished to preserve a literal interpretation of the biblical story of creation and the flood tried to link American Indians with some race in the Old World. Romans had argued in his book that such attempts had produced little more than a confused heap of nonsense and falsehood, but many became increasingly outspoken about what they considered growing evidence to support the opposing point of view. In addition to English and French, Spanish writers too were concerned about the theological implications of Indian origins, especially in view of their long contact with the Indians of Mexico and of Central and South America. Francisco Clavijero, a Jesuit who lived in Mexico until 1767, wrote an influential 3-volume history of Mexico, which was translated into English and published in London in 1787 and in Philadelphia in 1804. He mentions that those who question the authority of the sacred writings say the Americans derive not their origin from Adam and Noah, and goes on to argue that the Mexican tradition of a flood was proof that the Americans were descendants of Noah. Unfortunately, early writers like Clavijero paid little attention to the cultural context from which they took their evidences. Actually, the Aztecs believed the world had been created 5 times and destroyed 4. Each age ended violently through ferocious jaguars, a hurricane, volcanic eruptions, and a flood. Early writers invariably dismissed those elements of any story not corroborating the Bible as corruptions inspired by the devil. Like Clavijero, Paul Cabrera also cited Indian legends of a flood as evidence that their origins could be traced to the Old World. His confidently titled essay, Solution of the Grand Historical Problem of the Population of America, was published in 1822 in the same volume with explorer Antonio del Rio's description of the ruins of the ancient city discovered near Palenque, Guatemala. Del Rio was sent to Guatemala by the Spanish government in 1786 to examine whatever ruins he could find. His report inspired Cabrera to write his speculations on Indian origins. Cabrera denounced the pre-Adamite theory because he found that American antiquities, such as those discovered by Del Rio, were so like those of the Egyptians and other nations as to prove a connection has existed between them and the Americans, thus solving the grand historical problem of its population. Cabrera described the threat which the pre-Adamite theory posed to traditional Christianity. The darkness of this historical question opened the road to an attack upon the impregnable rock of religion. About the middle of the last century, Isaac Pereire erected his system of pre-Adamites, claiming that all the human race are not descendants of Adam and Eve, and consequently denies original sin and the principle of our holy Catholic religion, producing the population of America as the chief support of this hypothesis and the ignorance that exists as to the source of its origin. Cotton Mather, one of the leading Puritan ministers of his day, was among the first colonial Americans to recognize the threat of the pre-Adamite theory to religion. In a discourse he delivered in 1721 to the commissioners of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel among the American Indians, Mather declared, "Let a foolish Paracelsus and Perarius pretend what they will. We are sure that the Americans are of the Noetic original." Writers in the United States also pointed to discoveries in Mexico to support their theological positions. In his 1793 American Universal Geography, Jedediah Morse referred to the legends of a flood among Mexican Indians to validate his view that we ought to seek among the descendants of Noah for the first peoples of America. And Timothy Dwight, 8th president of Yale College, echoed these and other conclusions in his own book, published some 20 years later. The several traditions of the inhabitants of Hispaniola, Brazil, and several other countries in South America concerning the creation, the deluge, and the confusion of language cannot have been inventions of their own. The chances are many millions to one against their agreement in the formation of these traditionary stories. They are, therefore, complete proofs against the hypothesis that these people were indigenous inhabitants of America. Equally are they proofs that they sprang from a common stock, and this stock certainly existed in Asia. While some correctly guessed that Native Americans migrated across the Bering Strait, others speculated about transoceanic migrations from Phoenicia, Carthage, Wales, even Atlantis. Most, however, looked to the Bible and Apocrypha for answers. The dispersion from the Tower of Babel was one obvious possibility for the origin of ancient Americans. According to Genesis, the Lord confounded the language of the tower's builders and scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth. English theologian Sir Hammond Lestrange, for example, argued in 1652 that the first settlers of America were descendants of Noah's son Shem, who came from the tower. To many Christian apologists, however, the Babel theory seemed inadequate, since it did not explain how traces of the law of Moses and other Jewish-like customs, which they believed were observable among various Indian tribes, could be found among the Indians. Early writers experimented with several possible Jewish migrations. A flight from Sennacherib about 700 BCE, navigation during the time of Solomon, and a flight from the Romans at the destruction of Jerusalem around CE 70. But the theory that received the greatest support and captured the popular imagination in Joseph Smith's day identified Native Americans with the lost 10 tribes of Israel. The theory was based on the apocryphal book 2nd Esdras, written about 100 CE, and included in some 19th century editions of the Bible, where mention is made of the Assyrian captivity of the northern kingdom of Israel around 734 BCE. Ezra is told by an angel that after being carried captive into Assyria, the 10 tribes took this counsel among themselves, that they would leave the multitude of the heathen, and go forth into a further country, where never mankind dwelt. The whereabouts of the 10 tribes always mystified believers. When the Indians were discovered, many clerics believed the lost 10 tribes had finally been located. The tale of a Portuguese Jew named Antonio de Montezinos, or Aaron Levi, who had traveled in South America, became the centerpiece of the argument proposing Jewish ancestry for the American Indian. Returning to Amsterdam in late 1644, Montezinos astounded fellow Jews with the declaration that he had found the lost 10 tribes in Peru. According to Montezinos, an Indian named Franciscus, learning that Montezinos was Hebrew, had taken him into the wilderness to meet a group of Jews. This tribe of unknown people disclosed to Montezinos that they were of the tribe of Reuben and recited the Shema in Hebrew. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord." They also reportedly revealed to him their plan to one day destroy the Spaniards, liberate the Indians, and govern the whole continent. Montezinos' tale was much retold in Europe to support the existence of the 10 tribes in America. His interpretation of the event went unquestioned at the time, although one modern scholar has suggested a more plausible explanation for the group. A significant number of European Jews had migrated to South America shortly after its discovery. The Spanish Inquisition forced many of these Jews into the wilderness, and Montezinos may have found a group who had hidden themselves from their Spanish persecutors. Another Jew, Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel from Amsterdam, repeated Montezinos' story in a book published a few years later in 1650, which was translated and published in London the same year. He also assembled other evidences to support his belief in the Jewish origin of the Indians, such as the reported discovery of Hebrew inscriptions and Jewish synagogues in South America, and the similarity between certain Jewish and Indian customs. Manasseh connected the 10-tribe theory to biblical prophecy. The discovery of the 10 tribes in America was a sign that the Messiah's coming was imminent. Manasseh's millennial views regarding the American Indian impressed many English clergymen. One, Thomas Thorogood, rector of Grimston in Norfolk, published his own book on Indian origins the same year Manasseh's appeared, titled Jews in America, or Probabilities that the Americans are of that race. He included Montezinos' account and marshaled a millennialist argument in support of missionary work to the Indians. 10 years later, in 1660, Thorogood teamed up with John Eliot of Massachusetts, the famed apostle to the Indians, to write Jews in America, or Probabilities that those Indians are Judaical, made more probable by some additionals to the former conjectures. Eliot, one of the first in North America to embrace the 10-tribe theory, gathered Indian converts into a series of Christian communities, and with the help of Thorogood, he gained financial support from the Puritans in England for his missionary work. Others in New England shared Eliot's view that the Indians were of Hebrew descent. In 1697, Samuel Sewall, commissioner of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in New England, expressed his belief in the 10-tribe theory. And in 1788, Puritan Jonathan Edwards the Younger compared the language of the Mohican Indians to Hebrew. Roger Williams argued in 1643 that the key to understanding the Indian language was to compare it to Hebrew. And William Penn declared 40 years later that he was ready to believe that the Indians were of the stock of the 10 tribes. In 1775, an Englishman who had spent 40 years among the Indians, trader James Adair, published The History of the American Indians, which contained the most thorough defense to date of the Indian-Israelite theory, and continued the polemic against such writers as Lord Kames, who had championed the pre-Adamite theory. Adair presented 23 similarities between the Indians and the Jews, based mostly on his own observations of the Chickasaws and Cherokees, including their division into tribes and worship of Jehovah, their notions of theocracy, and their belief in the ministration of angels, their language and dialects, their manner of reckoning time, their prophets and high priests, their festivals, feasts, and religious rites, their daily sacrifices, their ablutions and anointings, their laws of uncleanliness, and their abstinence from unclean things, their marriage, divorce, and punishment for adultery, their cities of refuge, their purification and ceremonies before war, their ornaments, their manner of curing the sick, their burial and mourning for the dead, their raising seed to a deceased brother, and their choice of names derived from their circumstances. Adair's language comparisons are particularly interesting. He claimed, for example, that the Indians called upon Yohewah, which he thought may have been derived from the Hebrew Yahweh. While Adair accurately reported many Indian customs, which makes his book of continuing value to historians, his interpretations and comparisons are now viewed as naive and strained. Even in his own time, Adair was not universally believed. Historian Samuel G. Drake declared in 1841 that Adair tortures every Indian custom and usage into a like one of the Jews, and almost every word in their language became a Hebrew one of the same meaning. In a speech delivered before the New York Historical Society in 1819, Samuel Jarvis cautioned that attempts to link the American Indians with some group in the Old World led to many misrepresentations of the religious rites of its inhabitants, and affinities were discovered which existed nowhere but in the fancy of the inventor. This inventor, no doubt, was Adair, as Jarvis explained. An hypothesis has somewhat extensively prevailed, which exalts the religion of the Indians as much above its proper level as Volney has debased it below. I mean, that which supposes them to be the descendants of the 10 tribes of Israel. This theory so possessed the mind of Adair that, although he had the greatest opportunities of obtaining knowledge, his book is, comparatively, of little use. We are constantly led to suspect the fidelity of his statements, because his judgment had lost its equipoise, and he saw everything through a discolored medium. I feel myself bound to notice this hypothesis the more, because it has lately been revived and brought before the public by a venerable member of this society. The member Jarvis alluded to was Elias Boudinot, a former congressman and founder and first president of the American Bible Society, who in 1816 wrote A Star in the West, or A Humble Attempt to Discover the Long-Lost Tribes of Israel. This book drew heavily on the evidence of Adair and introduced a wide American audience to the theory of Israelite origins. Boudinot's title played off that of a book written by scholar Claudius Buchanan, A Star in the East. Buchanan's book, which ran through 10 American editions before 1811, had asserted that the 10 tribes were located east of Israel, in Persia and India. Those who identified the Indians with the lost 10 tribes were attempting to rescue them from extinction. Rather than seeing them as subhuman or inherently savage, proponents of the 10-tribe theory saw them as potential converts, worthy of salvation. Linking Indians with Old Testament prophecy regarding the gathering and restoration of Israel, they suggested that Native Americans might represent the last mission field before Jesus' return. This was the view of Ethan Smith, a Congregational clergyman who published View of the Hebrews, or The Tribes of Israel in America, in Pulteney, Vermont in 1823 and 1825. "If our natives be indeed from the tribes of Israel," he said, "American Christians may well feel that one great object of their inheritance here is that they may have a primary agency in restoring those lost sheep of the house of Israel." Ethan Smith quoted both Adair and Boudinot, as well as a variety of American and European sources, what historian Von Brody would later describe as all the items of 3 generations of specious scholarship and piecemeal observation on the subject. In October 1825, the Wayne Sentinel, Joseph Smith's local newspaper, published a speech by Mordecai M. Noah, a prominent New York Jew who purchased Grand Island in the Niagara River and there dedicated the city of Arat as a refuge for oppressed Jews around the world. In the dedicatory speech, Noah proclaimed, "The discovery of the lost tribes of Israel has never ceased to be a subject of deep interest to the Jews. I have reason to believe our lost brethren were the ancestors of the Indians of the American continent. Those who are most conversant with the public and private economy of the Indians are strongly of the opinion that they are the lineal descendants of the Israelites, and my own researches go far to confirm me in the same belief." After rehearsing Adair's evidences, Noah invited the Indians to join their fellow Jews on his island. Similar to Ethan Smith, Noah saw the discovery of the lost tribes in America as fulfillment of Bible prophecy. If the tribes could be brought together, could be made sensible of their origin, could be civilized, and restored to their long-lost brethren, what joy to our people! What glory to our God! How clearly have the prophecies been fulfilled! How certain our dispersion! How miraculous our preservation! How providential our deliverance! Based on the availability of such books and speeches, no doubt, Josiah Priest would write in his book American Antiquities in 1833, "The opinion that the American Indians are descendants of the lost 10 tribes is now a popular one and generally believed. Despite general acceptance of the 10-tribe theory, some question the propriety of relying on an apocryphal book, the authority and inspiration of which had increasingly come under attack." Acceptance of the Apocrypha was becoming a distinguishing feature between Catholics and Protestants, and in 1827 the American Bible Society removed it entirely from their editions. Proponents of the 10-tribe theory also found themselves at odds with those who preferred biblical explanations, since having Israelite colonists settle in a land where never mankind dwelt effectively ruled out earlier migrations from the Tower of Babel. To settle the controversy, Smith switched the location of the Israelitish departure from the northern kingdom of Israel to the southern kingdom of Judah, specifically to the capital city of Jerusalem, and changed the time from 734 to 600 BCE in order to have the migration party leave prior to the Babylonian captivity. This innovation made the task easier because a southern migration placed the story within familiar ground and allowed the narrative to draw from Old Testament prophets, especially Isaiah, whom the northern kingdom would not have known. Free of the restrictions imposed by the Esdras passage, a reconciliation of opposing views could be achieved. The Book of Mormon could therefore include an earlier migration to America from the Tower of Babel, thus retaining the concept of an ancient settlement in America, as well as a later migration that would explain the introduction of Jewish traits among New World populations. Despite apologetic attempts to recontextualize the Book of Mormon in harmony with current scientific understanding, Joseph Smith and early Mormons believed all Native Americans were remnants of the Book of Mormon's Lamanites, and hence also believed, like many of their contemporaries, they were of Israelite heritage. Writing by way of commencement to newspaper editor N.C. Saxton in 1833, Joseph Smith said, The Book of Mormon is a record of the forefathers of our Western tribes of Indians. By it, we learn that our Western tribes of Indians are descendants from that Joseph that was sold into Egypt, and that the land of America is a promised land unto them, and unto it all the tribes of Israel will come. Joseph Smith's revelations identified the Indians of North America with the Book of Mormon's Lamanites. Indeed, early missionaries were sent to the tribes just beyond the western border of the United States to fulfill the Book of Mormon's prediction of the book being taken to the Lamanites. Nephi declared, "And now I would prophesy somewhat more concerning the Jews and the Gentiles. For after the book of which I have spoken shall come forth, and be written unto the Gentiles, and sealed up again unto the Lord, there shall be many which shall believe the words which are written, and they shall carry them forth unto the remnant of our seed. And then shall the remnant of our seed know concerning us, how that we came out of Jerusalem, and that they are descendants of the Jews." At a church conference held on the 26th of September, 1830, at the home of Peter Whitmer Sr. in Fayette, New York, Joseph Smith dictated a revelation which commanded Oliver Cowdery to go unto the Lamanites and preach my gospel. Later the same day, another revelation instructed Peter Whitmer Jr. to journey with your brother Oliver and build up my church among the Lamanites. As the two missionaries prepared for their journey, the Mormon prophet received another revelation in Manchester, New York, on or just before the 17th of October, which instructed Parley P. Pratt and Ziba Peterson to accompany Cowdery and Whitmer. Shortly after arriving in Jackson County, Missouri, about February 1831, the missionaries crossed the western boundary line and began preaching to the Shawnee and Delaware Indians. A revelation Joseph Smith dictated in Ohio in June 1831 instructed Newell Knight, "And thus you shall take your journey into the regions westward, unto the land of Missouri, unto the borders of the Lamanites." Apologists suggest that the Indians were considered Lamanites politically because, they imagine, the Nephites considered all non-Nephites to be Lamanites, and to support this notion, they cite Doctrine and Covenants, section 10, verse 48. In this revelation, the Lord is represented as stating, "Yea, and this was their faith, that my gospel, which I gave unto them that they might preach in their days, might come unto their brethren the Lamanites, and also all that had become Lamanites because of their dissensions." Nothing in this passage justifies calling Asian populations Lamanites. It only acknowledges the existence of a few Nephites who had escaped destruction by defecting to the Lamanites during the final battle described in the Book of Mormon. Mormon observed that the Lamanites destroyed all the Nephites, save it were a few who had dissented over unto the Lamanites. Another revelation Smith dictated in July 1831 makes it clear that the term Lamanite was genetic and not merely a political designation. Wherefore it is wisdom that the land should be purchased by the saints, and also every tract lying westward, even unto the line running directly between the Jew and Gentile. Apologists also try to escape the implications of this evidence by suggesting that Joseph Smith's revelations only reflect his word choices as he tried to express the inspired concepts flowing into his mind and are not meant to be taken literally. This simply begs the question, since his choice of the word Lamanite must have been inspired by the concept of a literal Lamanite in his mind. Of course, apologists are free to speculate, redefine words, and show how clever they are at escaping troubling evidence. Just as long as they know, and we know, these Lamanites of Revelation were not really Jewish. Science has forced Mormon apologists to concede that the vast majority of Native Americans trace their lineages to Asia, not Israel. Yet they cling to the desperate and untestable theory that Lehi's undetectable DNA is out there somewhere. But before they go to such great lengths to defend the Book of Mormon, they might do well to ask themselves, what are the odds that the Book of Mormon would come forth at a time when it was a popular yet incorrect belief that the Indians were of Hebrew extraction. Indeed, Mormon apologists want us to believe that the Book of Mormon just happened to come forth at a time when Joseph Smith's contemporaries were using questionable theological speculation and shoddy scholarship to connect Native Americans to Israel and biblical prophecy in a similar fashion that would later be canonized in the Book of Mormon. They also want us to believe that Joseph Smith and first-generation Mormons mistakenly adopted this prevailing belief, and that God allowed this incorrect assumption to be reflected in many of the revelations Joseph Smith dictated. Isn't it much simpler to conclude that Joseph Smith put into his pseudo-scripture a notion of history that would make sense to his target audience, and that this historical assumption simply became outdated? I'm Dan Vogel. Thanks for watching.